One day I got a call to go to the Barquin Ranch. There'd been a murder. The suspect was Joe Cruz Martinez, one of Barquin's herders. The deceased, Ramon Gonzalez, another Mexican herder, was lying face up in his bed. He'd caught a bullet between his eyes. He looked like a man shot in deep slumber. We took Martinez down to the sheriff's office, where Pee-wee told Martinez that he'd found the rifle, that Martinez's fingerprints were on it, and he added it would be very kind of Martinez if he would now confess. At least that's how Pee-wee told it. Martinez signed a confession. Those were the days before Miranda, long before you had to tell a frightened suspect that if he said a word it could be used against him. In truth, no fingerprints had been lifted from the gun, and none had been matched to Martinez. The confession Martinez signed said that he and the dead man, Gonzalez, had been fighting over a woman. Martinez had shot Gonzalez in the head as he lay sleeping in the bunk. At the trial, the jury found Martinez guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. Suddenly, the full impact of my power as a prosecutor came slamming home to me. I could actually kill with my power. What had once been a lawyer's game against a frightened, not-too-bright Mexican sheepherder had been converted into his death warrant. I had just killed a man in a courtroom. I talked to Judge Sheldon about it. "I'm not sure I did the right thing," I said. "What do you mean? You did your job, the guy killed the other guy, the law's the law," Sheldon replied. In those days, all death penalty cases were automatically appealed to the Wyoming Supreme Court. Months later, I drove to Cheyenne to represent the state side of the case, the question, should Martinez be put to death? I myself asked the judges to reduce his sentence. My argument was that Martinez had been so drunk he was unable to form the specific intent to kill. That would change the charge from first to second-degree murder. Martinez's sentence would then not be death, but 20 years to life. Judge Parker, the same judge who in law school had warned me against staying in the law in response to my arguments there, reluctantly set aside the death penalty and reduced Martinez's sentence to second degree. Pee-wee wasn't happy. He told me, "You're a pansy, Spence. How the hell could he not have premeditated it, going to the house for the gun and all? When he gets out, he'll just go out and get drunk and kill somebody else." "Maybe," I said. "But if we're ever going to stop killing in this country, the state has to stop killing first." "If you're so damn solid against the death penalty," Pee-wee said, "maybe you shouldn't be in this job." And then I said, "Do there always have to be killers on both sides?" And he didn't answer, just kind of scowled. Pee-wee wasn't a man to hang on to a philosophical question. He was a man of simple solutions. A county prosecutor in the back counties of Wyoming gets plenty of courtroom experience. I'd try an aggravated assault and battery case one day and a first-degree murder case the next. During my first term in office, I never lost a case as a prosecutor. I was learning how to survive in the courtroom. I thought I had made a difference. Frank Hill and I would be able to make it on our own private practice, and I was ready to pass the responsibilities on to some other lawyer. The office had served me well, and I had served the county. I thought I might be able to buy some property someday. I thought I was happy. I was beginning to feel like a successful lawyer. I believed I was a good parent, and over the years I'd tried to bury the devastation of my mother's suicide. The early years in Riverton were years when I grew from late childhood to early manhood, and the town had provided a sheltered place for my maturation. But when the last day for filing for re-election was at hand, and when I saw the lawyers who were running for my office, I decided I'd better run one more time to make sure that what I had planted grew. I was proud of what I'd accomplished in the county, and what had been hard to accomplish could be lost overnight if the wrong prosecutor got into office. I was elected by a large majority, and during my second term I tried many more cases, none of which I lost. Not that such a record stands for much. With all of the power prosecutors possess, they ought not to lose cases. At the end of my second term, I decided it really was time for me to move on. I had learned how to talk to a jury and how to try a case. I was still young, just 33. One day, Judge Sheldon was sitting in his office, his feet up on his gray steel desk, looking at me. Here was this kid who, as a wide-eyed puppy, had started in his office. The judge gave me a toothy smile. "Jerry, you have what it takes to become a great trial lawyer." I didn't know what to say. "What do you mean?" "That's all I got to say," he said, puffing on a cigarette. His words created a vision. Such visions, if honestly imparted, are the greatest gift one person can bestow upon another. to be a trial lawyer. That had become the ambition of my life. In 1962, I came to the curious conclusion that Wyoming deserved to have me, a young, aggressive, skilled trial lawyer in Congress. I would take Washington by storm. I would fight for the people, there make a name for myself, and maybe become President of the United States. Why not? I was convinced that merely prosecuting the poor who robbed back, and the forgotten who struck back, and the despised did not fulfill my predestined role in the universe. It was time to burst into the big time. Moreover, something felt stifling to me in that small town of Riverton, like a child who had outgrown his playpen. I felt trapped in the town, but more, I felt the need to bloom, to become. My opponent was a nondescript, bland fellow by the name of William Henry Harrison, who'd already served in the House of Representatives for 3 terms. He was named after his grandfather, the 9th President of the United States. I filed in the Republican primary for Congress on the Republican ticket. My announcement, carried in all the newspapers in the state, created hardly a ripple. But I would knock on all the doors in the state and win again. I knew as much about running a statewide political campaign as a cowboy knows about the tax code. I brought in my brother Tom, then just 20, to help me run this thing I'd spawned. In those days, I was flying a small Cessna airplane. And when we got to Casper, Tom called the Casper Star-Tribune, the state's largest and most powerful newspaper. Had to have its support, at least its interest, at least its tolerance. "Gerry Spence is flying into town this afternoon," Tom said to Phil Macaulay, editor-in-chief, with all the enthusiasm he could muster. "So what?" Macaulay asked. "Don't you want to come out to the airport and meet him?" "What for?" Macaulay asked. In reporting the election results, the Associated Press said Gerry Spence, Fremont County attorney, was drubbed decisively. I carried my own home county, Fremont County, and that's about all. I was crushed. I'd knocked on every door. I felt betrayed. Down where you really know things, I realized my run for Congress had been about escaping Riverton. I wanted to be free of everything that seemed to snare me, my marriage, my parents' teachings, my partnership. Within a few weeks, I sat down with Frank. I wanted to end the partnership, I told him, and I thought that Frank needed to be free of me. Somehow, Frank Hill, who had always understood, still understood. Frank kept our building, and I built a new one across the street. There I opened my solo practice devoted to the specialty of trials. My new office was a sanctuary where people could drag in their problems, and in front of a fire in the red stone fireplace, I would listen to my client's pain. In the center of the room, I set a large, round oak table with oak captain's chairs to pull up. I would sit down with my client in a chair just like his, and without a desk separating us, we could talk, like people, like friends. Inside the small courtyard of my private office, I built a small waterfall that came tumbling down over the red stone, and the sound of the water soothed me. My isolation protected me and let me begin to heal. I hired Cleo Arguello, the Mexican-American wife of a quadriplegic client, whose husband I represented against Ford Motor Company, setting a record in Wyoming for personal injury verdicts. By her gentleness and quiet compassion, I was comforted. I built a bar inside my private office, and the sour mash whiskey also soothed me, or I thought it did. And of an evening, my friends and I drank and laughed and spoke of ribald matters. We were a cynical lot, and my new, deep cynicism sometimes soothed me, or I thought it did. The trap grew more oppressive, and I felt trapped by a marriage that had become a war with a roof over it. But I saw no way out. I was a married man, by this time a father of 4, a man with responsibilities, a father, a lawyer with duties to his clients. Often I stayed at the office late and drank with my friends into the night. "You're late for dinner as usual," Anna would scold. And then the fight would begin anew. She'd been at home all day working, taking care of kids, keeping a house. She'd prepared a dinner, and for whom? For a man who didn't care enough or respect her enough to come home at supper time? I was a tangled mass of pain and anger, and Anna was as trapped as I. Sometimes I would forego supper. Sometimes I'd just have another drink and stumble into bed. Sometimes Anna would drink with me, and at times that was better. And sometimes I couldn't remember, and sometimes I didn't care. On the cusp of crazy, desperate, I drank more. I thought of how it would be to die. I began to comprehend what must have been my mother's hopeless entanglement with a misery from which she could not escape. My God, I cried to myself, had I inherited my mother's propensity to self-destruction? At one point I said to Anna, "I'm crazy," I said. "You're not crazy," she argued. "You may be a little nuts sometimes. You may be mixed up. You may be hurt. But you're not crazy." It took a shrink in Denver to convince me that she was right. If when I was an adolescent my parents had suffered my revolt, so in my manhood the town of Riverton suffered my insurrection. I stomped capriciously, carelessly up and down the ribs of the town. More than once I heard a patient citizen sigh, "He's an insufferable son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." Only in the courtroom did I command the people's respect. If someone was in trouble, he came to me for advice. If a man was injured on the job, he came to me to fight for him against his employer. If a person was charged with a crime, he or she knew I could defend them. I fought for all of them, the lowly, the poor, and the powerless. I was their anger, I was their voice. As for my growing reputation as a trial lawyer, I knew what accounted for it: the consuming work, the meticulous preparing of every move, every detail, every question. I had become the hunter in the courtroom. And when people found it hard to understand why I didn't seem overjoyed when I won, I tried to explain. It wasn't joy I felt, but relief, like the gladiator who staggered from the arena, bloodied, saved to fight another war the next day, the next week. Each case was a final confrontation between life and death for me. But in the throes of a trial, my demons faded into legal briefs. The face of my mother dissolved into the faces of mothers clutching their dead children, mothers left penniless by delinquent husbands and beaten senseless by drunken spouses. In the heat of the trial, the tangled stuff within me was replaced with an indomitable anger that must have bewildered many of my opponents. Yet I was always afraid. My fear was of losing, for losing and betrayal, losing and failure, losing and dying had started to feel the same. It wasn't long before I began to set record verdicts for those times. One record verdict after another, verdicts in cases that shocked the judges and caused the lawyers in the state to shake their heads in disbelief. At one time, I held record verdicts in every category of personal injury case, libel, death cases, you name the damage record, I had it. I tried a wide range of cases, nearly always before a jury, and nearly always each verdict exceeded the last. It wasn't long before I was getting more for a sprained neck than I had previously gotten for a baby who had died. I told the juries the stories of my cases in the language of working people. I had learned storytelling from my father, for a true trial lawyer is a storyteller. Storytelling and listening to stories is in our genes. We hear stories and we're moved by them. Human beings do not respond to abstractions. If I were to choose but one skill from the grab bag of skills necessary for the successful trial lawyer, it would be the skill of storytelling. I hadn't lost a jury trial of any kind in over 10 years, but my successes, I thought, were attributable to the fact that my opponents were mostly mediocre regional lawyers who hadn't worked as hard or who didn't care as much. Eventually, I thought I would be found out by the real trial lawyers, those from Denver and Chicago and New York. Eventually, they would show me up for what I was, a frightened man with modest talent, a loud voice, a somewhat imposing demeanor, and great luck, and a man who, for many years, had been guilty of the tepid crime of overachieving. We might have been dysfunctional, but we remained a family, although sometimes just barely. One thing, we were honest about who we were, and what we believed and how we felt. Nothing hidden, no secret parental agendas. No lying to the kids about how Anna and I got along. Ugly as it might have been sometimes, it was all laid out there plain to look at. A couple of times I took the belt out, which I admit was wrong. But I also hugged my kids and squeezed them till they hollered, and I wrestled with them and I yelled at them and I loved them right out of their baggy little pants, and they knew by God that I loved them. They also knew I was nuts. They forgave me and loved me back. I built a studio in the rear of the house and I began to paint. I struggled with the mixing of colors, the stretching of canvas, the creation of form. I began to read art history and art criticism. I thought that surely painting was a way out of my trap. Soon my escape became my brush, my creations in oil, as haunting and tortured as Van Gogh's. Self-portraits, paintings of wounded birds, of crows caught in the snow, paintings of withered bird carcasses, human carcasses, paintings that reflected pain, not joy, agony, not redemption. I painted with a fervor. Sometimes I physically attacked the canvas with the brush. Sometimes I shot holes through the painting with a pistol. Sometimes I painted rapaciously into the night. Sometimes I painted drunk. My marriage was tortured. Still, I thought it could never be worn away. It could absorb the madness, take whatever was thrown at it, whatever injury, whatever insult, whatever infidelity. The marriage could withstand the drinking and the screaming into the night, take it like the rocks at the bottom of a pounding waterfall. In the 1960s, even in Riverton, Wyoming, the boys were letting their hair grow long. Anna and I had become pseudo-hippies ourselves. I began to further test the values that had been plastered on me as a child, and the plaster was cracking. Maybe work wasn't what life was all about. Maybe you could escape your traps in the mountains and deep talks with nature, and with yourself in poetry and painting. I began to take the summers off, took the family to a little ranch I'd bought, 120 acres by a clear mountain stream, a place called Hidden Valley on the reservation. Nothing to do up there but paint and fish and write poetry. The flower children were in revolt. The flower children were my children. The flower children were Anna and I. We were all in revolt, against authority, against custom, historical wisdom, religion, especially religion. We were in revolt against each other. We loved each other, but love in the war zone is a hard crop to grow. One day a claims man from St. Paul Insurance Company came to visit me, one of those nice, smiling fellas. "Jerry," he said, "we're tired of having you shove our cases up our ass. We'd like you to join our team. What do you say?" Well, now you can claim to believe this or that. You can pray and preach and strut and tremble in righteous rage. But when you hit the here and now and slam your principles up against a shot at money or power, something happens. Watch principle fade into a haze of rationalizations. "I'll just do it once," becomes the refrain. A man hates the rich, then falls into it, makes a pile of money. Guys say all politicians are crooks and he'd never be one. Then they appoint him to the city council and he runs for mayor. I know people who go to church every Sunday and pray, and then cheat their customers half an ounce at a time on the scales the rest of the week. Principle in the abstract has a hard time surviving when faced with the corrupted reality. I wanted to be a great trial lawyer, and I wanted a way out of Riverton. Even if I had to back off of principle a little, make a little concession, nobody would condemn me for that. My competitors would be envious. I took a case for the company. Then a couple. It's easy to slip into it. You get hardened to what you do, and it gets to be okay after a while. It's dangerous, this getting hardened to things. You argue yourself out of your humanity. Your soul leaks away, one small drip at a time. You hardly notice it. You plaster it up with arguments like, "Somebody has to do it, just as well be me." Pretty soon, you don't have any time for arguments. Pretty soon the word got around. Spence was working for the insurance companies. Spence was a winner. Other insurance companies began sending me their claimsmen. There's a place at the bedrock of a man where his footings stand, and there I must have realized I was on the wrong side. I must have fought off the guilt, but I had become an expert at sloughing off guilt. Honorable men and women represent big money and big companies. Yet I must have known that representing insurance companies against injured people, against my own kind of people, was a waste of life. In the end, I must have known. Power is the bastard child of money. I met this kind of ordinary-looking fellow, John C. Johnson. That was his name. He called himself a recovering Catholic. He was a wise man. For many years he was my best friend, and I loved him as much as any man can love a man. When I first met John, he was working at the Fremont County Mental Health Clinic as a psychiatric social worker. He traveled once a week to Riverton, where he set up an encounter group. I was searching, so was Anna. Our group consisted of 10 or 12 ordinary men and women with various problems, troubled marriages, emotional pain. We wanted to learn more about who we were, and that was to be accomplished by a simple technique, telling the truth. This new experience of encounter grouping seemed radical, but the idea was simple and right. To become a person, one had to first become acquainted with oneself, and that required one to become aware of one's feelings. And after that, to become a person, one had to develop the elusive skill of sharing one's feelings with others. When the notion of these simple propositions sank through, it struck me like salvation staggers the born again. Before I had felt, and deeply. Before I had been only too aware of my feelings. But mostly I fought them back. Feelings caused pain. Feelings were dangerous. If one could contain one's feelings, perhaps one could survive in this world. I thought that. But now suddenly, feelings were it. In the group I became the protagonist. Often I became too powerful, too unrelenting, too aggressive, too oppressive. To some I became a sort of shaman. To others I was a frightening ogre. Then one day John Johnson took me aside. "The Episcopal clergy and their wives are going to have a couples group," he said. "You and Anna ought to go." In the late winter of 1968 we met. Anna and I, and 6 Episcopal priests and their wives. The meeting, 3 days long, was held at a mountain retreat east of Du Bois. I was hostile and arrogant as usual, and more disturbed than I had ever known. My hostility was there to diffuse the pain. My mother was there, of course, couldn't get rid of her. Her ghost was nearly palpable. One late night before I had joined the group, I painted her ghost, and I brought the painting as if to bring her along, in an earthly form, so she could be seen and touched, and therefore dealt with. During the second day I stood before the group and held up the painting. "I am God," I said, mocking the clergy. "I have made my mother in my own image." The clergy stared at the haunting canvas, a ghost-like form glistening through the layers of glazes. Suddenly the group leader said, "Let's get rid of the ghost of your mother. Let's burn her up. Throw her in the fire." There was a fire in the fireplace. I stood there suddenly unable to speak. At last I began to weep. I was ashamed. The leader struck again. "Are you afraid to burn the witch?" A preacher came over and quietly put his arm around me. He said, "You only need to burn the ghost that haunts you." I stood there, the tears flowing, humiliated. Then the others came around me and stood with me, and I threw the painting in the fire, and we watched the flames suck up the paint and the glaze, and I saw the face become the fire, and I was horrified, for once again I had destroyed my mother. Yet strangely I was relieved. But ghosts are not so easily destroyed. At John's suggestion, I went to Bethel, Maine for training in an advanced group. The ghost of my mother followed me there. There one evening the trainer had me speak to the ghost. She put her watch on the floor. "This is your mother," she said. "Talk to your mother." I stared at the watch. Finally I said to it, "Why did you leave us, Mother?" The watch was silent. "Your mother can speak through you," the trainer said. Silence. Then, "I had to go," I heard my mother answer. "Why?" I asked. My mother's whisper from my lips. "I couldn't stand the pain." It wasn't you. It was my pain from my own life. "But I loved you," I said. "How, if you loved me, could you hurt me so?" I began to weep, and the voice whispered back, "It was you who hurt you." When I returned to Riverton, I began working as a trainer with a group on my own. We met at my office one evening a week. I'd been afraid that if I explored down there at the bottom where the ugly stuff was hidden, I would be repulsed. I discovered something different. Down there I found a fragile man, a man who was afraid and who had always been afraid, and I learned something very hard to learn, that it was all right to love oneself. I began to incorporate what I'd learned in the groups into my trial work. I began to better understand the witnesses, the judges, the juries. I was able to hear both what was said and what was not said. People reported that a new sort of aura surrounded me, a power they did not fully understand, which followed me into the courtroom. Once a lawyer thought I must be hypnotizing the juries to win those hopeless cases, and he moved the court to order me to stop hypnotizing the juries, which the court found as ludicrous as I. I learned that great power grew out of listening and hearing, and I realized that if I could feel my own fear, feel my own sense of weakness and powerlessness, I could recognize it in others. If I could speak of my feeling in a straight way, others could hear me, the judge, the jurors. It was as if people in the courtroom suddenly became members of a brotherhood. To admit to being a person and to admit that others are persons as well, that becomes a power in a courtroom. Often John Johnson and I painted together, drank together, staggered and laughed and raged together. Sometimes we skied together. One January day in 1968, during a scorching white blizzard, we skied down Rendezvous Peak in the Tetons, a sheer rock slope covered with deep, blowing, high-altitude snow. I fought the mountain all the way, lost all the way, fell and rolled, got up, headed down again, fell again until nearly exhausted I finally made it all the way down. We took off our boards and limped into the Alpenhof for lunch. Then I saw her. I have spoken of the event many times, the Rubicon of my life. The woman had raven hair and wild blue cat eyes that caused every other woman to turn from her and made every man stare. I spoke out to the entire restaurant, yet she knew I was speaking to her. "Well, how do you get down from that Rendezvous Peak? It scares the hell out of me." It was as if the two of us were the only two in the room, and she answered politely, amused. "You put a hot little skier in front of you who says, 'Come on, baby.'" She was beckoning with her finger. "And you follow her down." That's what she said. Said it right back, smart-like. Seeing the woman was proof of something. Call it preordination, if you wish. Call it the hand of Providence. To behold that woman that day at that place, it was like creation. It was the creation of a new life for me. I did not speak to her again that day. Then months later I was in Casper to try a case in the district court, and I'd gone to the Ramada for lunch, and she was there, sitting with a girlfriend. I didn't have the slightest idea what I was going to say to her. I was on the verge of a stammer. Then I sat down next to her. I pushed her over with my hips to make room, kind of snuggled in the booth next to her, and then I said, "Give me a bite of your steak." She seemed amused. "Oh, I remember you. You're the one who couldn't get down off of Rendezvous Peak. I see you made it." She cut a piece of steak and fed me like a child. Her girlfriend was angry. "Who is this jerk anyway? Who invited you to the party?" I ignored the other woman, my eyes locked on this woman. For Christ's sake, the closer you got to her, the more beautiful she was. She was still amused. Later, when they got up to leave, I caught her and stopped her at the door. "How about your phone number?" "Friends give each other phone numbers, don't they?" "I haven't any time for that," she said. "I've been through all that before. I watched her drive off in a new Thunderbird. But I knew people in the bar who knew her, and I called her that evening." "No, you can't come up here. What's the matter with you?" "Why, is your husband home?" I asked. "I don't want to see you." "I have to see you. How do I get to your place?" She hung up. From the map in the front of a phone book, I tried to locate where she lived. Then I ran to my car and began to drive, but I couldn't find the street. I found a pay phone. I called again. "I'm lost," I said. I told her the name of the street I was on. "Where's your place from here?" "You must be crazy," she said. "Go away." She hung up. But there was something in the voice, not disgust, not alarm. I started driving up and down the streets, and suddenly I recognized her Thunderbird in front of a house. I walked up to the door and I rang the bell. After a while, the door opened a crack, the chain securely in place. "Hi," I said, a big smile on my face. "How did you get here?" she asked. "Let me in," I said. "Get out of here," she said. She shut the door. I knocked on the door again. Once more she opened it a crack. "Shh, you'll wake up my kids. If you don't let me in, I'm going to serenade you out here in the street, and I'll wake up the whole neighborhood." I pulled up my most powerful baritone and began singing like Ezio Pinza. "With a song in my heart, I behold your adorable face." "All right," she said, "you win." She was laughing. "But you have to promise, just for a moment." "Of course, I promise," I said. We did not understand what happened. I was 39 years old, allegedly sane, on the edge of sanity at least, and this insane thing? We were both frightened, but we would be safe enough if we never fell in love. Love was the danger. We met in secret places, small hotels and motels, and one night we were together and I dreamed her name and woke up laughing. She was startled. "What is it?" she asked. "I just dreamed a poem, and I recited it while it was still fresh in my mind. An untoothed crow came imaging around and mocked right up to Mockery Town. Said he, 'Some think I'm just a clown, but to me I'm a drowned dog, and that's what I've maintained all along.'" I sat up in bed and laughed some more. "Your name is Imogene Crow," I said, and that has been her name ever since. And one day she named me Adam, the first man, the first for her. It was insane, and we knew it. I was a husband, a father of 4, in love with the mother of another man's children. She had 2 small, handsome boys, Brent's about 8 and Christopher not yet 3. She had already divorced their father once, but in a desperate concern to keep the family together, she had remarried her husband. She was 28. I was 10 years older. I remained busy in my office. By this time I was making good money, steady money from my insurance company clients. And although I won, I grew unhappy in my work. I felt empty. I drank more whiskey, thought it helped. Drank it even though I knew it didn't. I found myself arranging my days around the time when I could have a drink. Just as well arrange your days around the bottle as anything else, I thought. Then I grew weary of the guilt I bore over my mother's death, never decreased its capacity to cause pain. A whip always cuts better with use. And having become an expert at dancing with guilt, I took on the guilt of my betrayal of Anna and held it close to me. At first I had lied to her. I lacked the courage to injure her further. But the voice betrays, the words too, and the body jerks when it should be still, stiffens when it should be easy, the hands drop things, and the eyes try to escape, and a woman knows. And at last she came on to us together. Anna and I had built a nest together. Maybe it was ramshackle and hanging by small threads from a limb. Maybe it was swaying wildly in the wind. But it was the nest we had built, and we were both in it along with our kids. I could not give up Imogene, but I could not leave Anna. Still the time came when I could no longer sleep in our bed. My back to her, I could no longer eat at our table, my eyes unable to look up from my plate. When I announced that I was moving out of the house, Anna walked up to me very quietly and asked, "Why are you leaving?" "Because I have to," I said. She began to cry, and she cried for a long time. I moved into a small 3-bedroom house on the other side of town. I asked the children to help me move. Perhaps, I thought, I could convince them I hadn't abandoned them, even in my leaving. I remember the innocent child Kent and that small blonde angel Katie, then only 6. I remember their eyes wide and hurt as they helped me unload my things from the car. After I moved, I called Imogene, who after her divorce was still living in Casper. Sometimes she spent afternoons helping me make the Stark rooms comfortable. She had been an interior decorator for some time, and she knew how to do such things without much money. I had to grow up. I thought if, at 40, I could finally grow up, everything would maybe work out all right. I continued to live alone in that strange, small little house. Months passed. The loneliness grew like thistles. When Imogene and I were together, my loneliness disappeared, only to return when we parted. I longed too much for her. I missed my children too much. I was too guilty over Anna. Often I thought back about my mother. Was this the sort of inescapable pain she had experienced? I thought if I could escape the town, perhaps I could heal. Perhaps I would see Anna differently. Maybe there would be a place outside the trap. I also felt trapped by my possessions. I developed a plan. I would sell everything, leave Riverton, abandon the practice, leave my friends, leave my clients, leave my history, and I would run even from Imogene, and perhaps I could be free. Anna was in agreement. I rented the vacant Western Auto Store building in downtown Riverton. I took a full-page ad in the Riverton Ranger. I called the sale Spence's Last Remark. The sale would be on June 6, 1969. I sold all of my guns, my archery equipment, my paintings, our old clothes, new clothes, bikes, skates, fishing poles. They were all part of the trap, and I got rid of all of them. We sold our home, the Hidden Valley Ranch, my office building, everything, right down to the extra toothbrush. I would give up the law. The law was not an instrument by which justice could be delivered to the people. I had witnessed its failures for almost 20 years. I was sick of the deceit, the deviousness, the lawyer games of the judges pretending to be the guardians of justice when they were the handmaidens of the rich. The law had served me well, and I it, and we were even. I remember the night I told Imogene I was going back to Anna. Had to make one last honest try, I told her. I couldn't look at Imogene. I couldn't touch her to comfort her. The next morning, on a gray, drizzly day, I left with Anna and the children for Mill Valley, California. There we leased a house in the Redwoods. It was strange to walk on those streets, just another lost soul in cut-offs and sandals, where once I'd been somebody, admired, despised, but somebody to everybody. Here I was nobody. I felt as if I had died, and no one knew. But every day, sometimes a dozen times a day, I called Imogene. "Are you there, darling?" "Yes, I'm here," she'd reply. But still I couldn't leave Anna. I had to hire another shrink. "Get me out of this well with its oozy green sides," I said to the shrink, and after 2 months, I was finally able to crawl out of the well. Less than 2 months after I had fled to Mill Valley with my family, I called Imogene from a payphone to tell her the news. "I'm coming back, honey," I heard myself saying. Silence. "When?" "I'm leaving this afternoon." "Are you coming back for good?" "Yes," I said. When I returned home, Anna was waiting. She looked at me. I didn't have to tell her. "Where are you going?" she asked. I began packing my bags. "Back to Wyoming," I said. "I belong in Wyoming." Anna stood silent, watching. I said goodbye to little Katie and kissed her and whispered that I loved her and that I would never leave her and that I was leaving Mill Valley, not her. Then I was outside in the front yard. I threw my bag in the trunk of the car. "You left your boots, Daddy," Katie said, running to me. I looked down. I was barefooted. Anna had followed me out to the car. "Can't you come back in and sit down and say goodbye? After all of these years, can't you say goodbye to me?" It was August 2nd, 1969, my father's birthday. In panic, I turned from her, slammed the car door, and drove off down the road barefooted, my boots still standing in the living room. The bed was a magical bed, I have no doubt of that. I have thought, if any were so fortunate as to have slept in that bed, they could not but experience its benevolent power, for the magic of it would surely change their lives. A fine walnut mallard bed of the Victorian period, its tall headboard dominated the room. It had belonged to Imogene's Aunt Flo. The bedroom was on the second floor of one of those old English-style houses in Casper. At daybreak we sat quietly, propped up against our pillows, peering into the rising steam from our coffee. It was a good time of the day, the kids still in their bedrooms below, and it was in that magic bed where our lives took root and began to grow and bloom. My divorce from Anna had been one of those default affairs in an empty courtroom, all of the property and custody issues having been previously worked out by the lawyers, the assets split down the middle. That was in 1969, and within days after my divorce, Imogene and I had run off to Tahoe to get married. The Sunday morning shrinks would have said I had escaped one trap only to fall into another. But a trap of love is not a trap. It's heaven with a fence around it. In bed, Imogene and I talked quietly about the war we were fighting. We were a new entity with 6 kids, and we had a lot of enemies out there waiting. We knew that. The first enemy we had to whip was booze. Our morning sessions in the magical bed became our daily meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And most mornings we talked about my mother thing, as we called it. The same old hang-up, the guilt, and always the question, why? You can't deal with all of these thoughts coming in from every direction unless you're stone-ass sober. We beat the booze, and we began to win most of the wars. I was learning as well in that magical bed how to deal with that whip called guilt. One morning, shortly after we were married, Imogene and I were sitting in bed sipping coffee, and I was thinking about the trial I had won for an insurance company the day before. An old man had been badly injured in a car wreck, caused by a drunk, a woman insured by the company we represented. The old man had been about to retire. He'd given up the best part of his life in the hell-hole of the refinery in Casper, making a living for his family, all those years waiting for his payback, his retirement. He planned to go fishing with his grandchildren, spend balmy days in the mountains with his wife. But that was before our drunk ran into him. It was over for him after that. Now all over, except for his pain, which would never go away. After the jury returned its verdict, Imogene and I had gone to Safeway to gather the fixings for a celebration. We'd filled our grocery cart, and when we rolled up to the checkout line, an old man was standing in front of us. Hearing our voices behind him, he slowly, painfully turned around, and for the first time I was up close to him. Up close, I saw his eyes were pale blue and watery, like Grandpa Spence's. It was the man I had just beaten at court. "I'm sorry the way your case came out," I finally said. I saw the marks of pain on his face. I heard his labored breathing. Before he had been the adversary, the person the law gave me the right to kill in the courtroom, the person from whom I could steal justice legally. The old man said, "You don't need to be sorry, Mr. Spence. You were just doing your job." Then he said it again, as if to convince himself. "You were just doing your job, Mr. Spence." He gave me a small, sad smile. I helped the old man out with a sack of groceries, and he thanked me. And Imogene and I went home, young, healthy, powerful, in love, the two of us off to celebrate having beaten an old, hurt man. It was that following morning in the magical bed that I said, "Imogene, is that my job, to cheat old men out of justice?" She was silent. She is a wise one, that Imogene, one who knows how to make great points with silence. I could still see the old man's weary face. I thought of my grandfather Spence and of my grandfather Flieger. I saw my parents, and I saw the hope that was reflected in their eyes when they looked at me. Even as a child I saw it. I was the product of the toil of those generations. I was their blood, their history. I was their immortality, as our children are ours. Surely they hoped that the devotion of their genes would do something more than work to the profit of the insurance companies. Surely they had hoped for something better than my cheating poor old men out of their justice. I jumped out of bed, threw on my clothes, and ran out the door. "Where are you going?" Imogene asked. "Gotta do something," I said. I drove to the office. "Gotta talk to you," I said to my partner Bob Rose. When I had returned from Mill Valley, he'd made room for me in his practice in Casper. "Bob, how can we do this for the rest of our lives?" I told him about the night before and the old man at Safeway. "I've been thinking about it a long time myself," Bob said. "Makes you sort of sick." "The money?" I asked. "We can make it," he said. I composed a letter to all of the insurance companies and other corporations Rose and I represented. They would please send their representatives to pick up their files. We would no longer represent them. And after that, I refused to represent any insurance companies, and any banks, and any more of those invisible creatures called corporations. After that, I represented the lost and the forgotten and the hated. I took on the cases of the people against the powerful. Over the years, my decisions seemed to somewhat muffle the demons. As for my mother, she began to hang out in the shadows and became a more silent observer. And sometimes, through the dim light of the early morning, when the first beams of the sun danced over the covers on our magical bed, I thought at last I saw my mother smile. Why had my mother, who had never exhibited the first suggestion of violence, turned the ultimate human violence on herself? How could my mother, who was sinless as any saint, have committed that one unforgivable sin? The ghostly finger continued to point at me, and although as the years flew by, the ghost more often stood quietly by, still the why of my mother's suicide remained a persistent pain at my core. As I began to write this book, I read anew my father's autobiography, The Evolution of a Hillbilly Kid, he called it. Perhaps during all of those painful years I hadn't wanted to look closer at my mother's last days, for fear that what I might see might magnify my pain. My father had written, quote, Esther worked quite closely with this Bolivian fellow, Pastor Meneses. He was at our house frequently, and at all hours. We got word that Pastor Meneses had been killed by the Indians, stoned to death. It really shook Esther up. Every time we talked about it, tears filled her eyes. Had she fallen in love with Pastor Meneses? Esther was having trouble sleeping, he went on to write. Several times I was awakened by her crying. I would ask her what the trouble was, and she would reply, I don't know, I just can't sleep. I would roll over and hold her close, and she would quiet down. In my dream, when the music stopped, my mother and I walked from the dance floor to the edge of the crowd. I thought that we should get the matter settled between us. Why did you leave us, Mother? I never left, she said. Where have you been then all of these years? I asked in my dream. I couldn't sleep, she said. She was looking off into the distance. I grew old without sleeping. And then I saw the natives circling around the man, and I heard them chanting and jeering. He was a smallish Bolivian with a mustache, and he had both arms over his head trying to fend off the rocks that the ragged, barefoot, screaming mob was hurling at him. The stones landed on the man and struck his arms where he protected his head, and hit his back with a terrible thud of rock on flesh, and soon the man fell, and he took the fetal position, his arms still over his head. Then the mob moved in close to him, and at the edge of the crowd I saw my mother. She was horror-stricken, and her hands were at her face, and she was weeping. And in my dream I heard her crying, and after that the mob made quick work of the missionary, and his skull was crushed in. And in the distance I saw my mother running, and after that I never saw her again.
In the years that followed, Gerry Spence went on to try the renowned Karen Silkwood case, which elevated him into national prominence, a case in which the jury awarded his client a verdict in excess of $10 million. After that, he obtained a series of multi-million-dollar verdicts, including a $52 million verdict against McDonald's for a small bankrupt ice cream company, a $26 million verdict against Penthouse magazine for Miss Wyoming, a settlement in excess of $40 million for the workers against U.S. Steel, and numerous other multi-million-dollar verdicts. During the more than 20 years that followed the time frame of this book, Gerry Spence's court work has changed the face of trial law in America. He has successfully defended numerous first-degree murder cases, obtained acquittals for Imelda Marcos and Randy Weaver of Ruby Ridge, and has not lost a jury trial since 1969. He has never lost a criminal case, either as a prosecutor or as a defense attorney. For over 25 years, he has refused to represent banks, insurance companies, big business, big corporations, and, unless as in the Imelda Marcos case, there are overshadowing public issues, he also refuses to represent the rich and famous.